This video is sponsored by Shortform. Does anyone really like the process of reading when all you want is to learn way more than what we have time for? I'm pretty sure that if you like absorbing knowledge, there are probably loads of books that you just haven't got around to picking up yet. Because of a busy schedule, procrastination, you get sidetracked from things, and it probably annoys you a little bit because sometimes there just isn't enough time in the day to learn the ideas you have always wanted to learn. Until you come across Shortform. Shortform makes the world's best guides and summaries for all the non-fiction books you would ever want to read. They're like book summaries on steroids. They're super detailed, so you get the book's key points at a deep level. They have interactive exercises to help you apply the ideas you just learned so that you develop a bulletproof memory in the process. They add smart insights like connecting what one author thinks about another to the point where you end up understanding the ideas at such a deeper level of insight that reading a book often just ends up taking longer to ultimately get a weaker understanding. To learn more than ever from important non-fiction books that you've always wanted to read, join me on Shortform at shortform.com/thoughtsonthinking. You'll get a 5-day free trial and a 20% annual sub-discount subscription if you use my URL at shortform.com/thoughtsonthinking, which you can find in the description and comment section down below. Bill Gates is the new David Rockefeller. The current coronavirus pandemic appears to be a global exercise of the powers of global institutions, an agenda spearheaded by Gates and his foundation, which is reported to be the largest private foundation in the world. Gates has been a frequent attendee of the Bilderberg conferences, founded in 1954 by David Rockefeller and others, whose ultimate aim is the establishment of a world treasury and World Health Authority by orchestrating a credit crunch or pandemic. Ever since at least 2009 at a Bilderberg conference, Gates has been actively involved in discussions about the threat of a global pandemic. Gates' window of opportunity was finally realised with the advent of the coronavirus, which he described on February 28, 2020 as the quote, one-in-a-century pathogen we've been worried about. In 2020, together with the UK research charity Wellcome and MasterCard, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation founded the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator to hasten the research and ultimate vaccine for the coronavirus. Gates has credited the generosity and extensive philanthropy of David Rockefeller as a major influence. Like David's grandfather, John D. Rockefeller, Gates acquired his enormous wealth through deception and monopolization of the most important resources of his time. Following the American Civil War, Rothschild's agent Jacob Schiff had begun to finance the great operations of the robber barons, such as the Standard Oil Company for John D. Rockefeller, the Railroad Empire for Edward R. Harriman, and the Steel Empire for Andrew Carnegie. John D. Rockefeller was tasked by the Rothschilds, through their agent John Jacob Astor and Jacob Schiff, to gain control of the American oil industry. Using highly aggressive tactics, later widely criticized, Rockefeller's Standard Oil absorbed or destroyed most of its competition and achieved near monopoly throughout the United States. Also in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which forbade any scheme constituting a, quote, restraint of trade. The Standard Oil Group quickly attracted attention from antitrust authorities, leading to a lawsuit filed by Ohio Attorney General David K. Watson. Federal Commissioner of Corporations studied Standard Oil's operations from the period of 1904 to 1906 and concluded that, quote, beyond question, the dominant position of the Standard Oil Company in the refining industry was due to unfair practices, to abuse of the control of pipelines, to railroad discriminations, and to unfair methods of competition in the sale of the refined petroleum products. Finally, by 1911, public outcry reached a climax and the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil was to be dissolved under the Sherman Antitrust Act and split into 34 companies. As Standard's president, however, since he owned a quarter of the shares of the resultant companies, and those share values mostly doubled, John D. Rockefeller emerged from the dissolution as the richest man in the world. John D. Rockefeller, along with his son John D. Rockefeller Jr., founded the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. According to one of his disciples, Rockefeller was inspired to turn to charity. The purported mission of the Rockefeller Foundation was to, quote, promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Essentially, by applying for tax-exempt status, their donors avoid a tax expense and can then use those funds to pursue various political goals. The Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations and comparable organizations, also known as the Reece Committee, an investigative committee of the United States House of Representatives between 1952 and 1954, found that the major foundations had been involved in subversive activities. Norman Dodds, who served as chief investigator, began with a definition of, quote, subversive, saying that the term referred to, quote, an action having as its purpose the alteration of either the principle or the form of the United States government by other than constituted means. He then proceeded to show that the Ford and Rockefeller foundations were using funds excessively on projects at Columbia, Harvard, Chicago University, and the University of California in order to, quote, enable oligarchical collectivism. It was also discovered by him that these or other foundations were involved in the intentional instigation of the United States into World War II and attempting to mold world history through the explicit control of education in the United States. Likewise, despite Gates's denial in the 1998 United States versus Microsoft case, the judge ruled that Microsoft had committed monopolization, trying and blocking competition, both in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Nevertheless, since 1987, Gates has been included in the Forbes list of the world's wealthiest documented individuals. From 1995 to 2017, he held the Forbes title of the richest person in the world all but 4 of those years. In October 2017, he was surpassed by Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos, who had an estimated net worth of $90.6 billion US dollars compared to Gates' net worth of $89.9 billion US dollars at the time. Exactly like Rockefeller, Gates bought back his reputation by using his immense wealth for, quote, charitable purposes to disguise spending his money to drive his political agenda. Gates studied the work of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and donated some of his Microsoft stock in 1994 to create the William H. Gates Foundation. In 2000, Gates and his wife combined 3 family foundations, and Gates's donated stock value at $5 billion to create the charitable Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was identified by the Funds for NGOs company in 2013 as the world's wealthiest charitable foundation, with assets reportedly valued at more than $34.6 billion. According to a major study by the Independent Global Policy Forum, organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and others are using their immense wealth and influence with political and scientific elites to promote solutions to global problems that may undermine the UN and other international organizations. With assets of more than $360 billion, the world's 27 largest foundations give roughly $15 billion US dollars annually to charitable causes. 19 of the 27 are American. By far the largest donor, according to the study, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which in 2012 gave $2.6 billion American dollars. This compares with $1.2 billion American dollars from the next 9 largest US trusts. In 2017, during the Davos World Economic Forum, Gates initiated CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, together with the governments of Norway, India, Japan, and Germany, along with the Wellcome Trust of the UK, the fourth wealthiest charitable foundation in the world. CEPI's stated purpose is to, quote, accelerate the development of vaccines we'll need to contain outbreaks of future epidemics. In October 2019, the Gates Foundation teamed up with the World Economic Forum and the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security for a simulation named Event 201 to enact what they called a, quote, fictional scenario simulation involving some of the world's leading figures in public health. As reported by Whitney Webb, Event 201, as with a similar simulation called Crimson Contagion, share a common history with the 2001 biowarfare simulation Dark Winter. At Andrews Air Force Base in Camp Springs, Maryland, several congressmen, a former CIA director, former FBI director, government insiders, and privileged members of the press met to conduct a biowarfare simulation called Dark Winter that would precede both the September 11 attacks and the 2001 anthrax attacks by a matter of months. It specifically simulated the deliberate introduction of smallpox to the American public by a hostile actor. The simulation was a collaborative effort led by the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies, part of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in collaboration with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Among the principal designers, authors and controllers of the Dark Winter project was Tara O'Toole of the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies. She was a principal author and producer of Atlantic Storm, a simulation operated on January 14, 2005 in Washington, D.C. to reveal the current international state of preparedness and possible political and public health issues that might evolve from a bioterror incident. Atlantic Storm was sponsored by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Organization efforts were provided by the Center for Biosecurity of UPMC, the Center for Transatlantic Relations of Johns Hopkins University, and the Transatlantic Biosecurity Network. O'Toole served as the Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Science and Technology from 2009 to 2013. She's currently a Senior Fellow and Executive Vice President at In-Q-Tel, a CIA front which invests in high-tech companies. In-Q-Tel now engages with entrepreneurs, growth companies, researchers, and venture capitalists to deliver technologies that provide superior capabilities for the CIA, DIA, NGA, and the wider intelligence community. In 2005, In-Q-Tel sold its shares of Google worth over $2.2 million, which were a result of Google's acquisition of Keyhole Incorporated. The name for the Dark Winter derives from a statement made by Robert Kadlec, a veteran of the George W. Bush administration and a former lobbyist for military intelligence and intelligence contractors, who is now leading HHS COVID-19 response and led the Trump administration's 2019, quote, Crimson Contagion exercise. Crimson Contagion was a simulation administered by the Department of Health and Human Services from January to August 2019 that tested the capacity of the US federal government and 12 US states to respond to a severe influenza pandemic originating in China. The exercise involves a scenario in which tourists returning from China spread a respiratory virus in the United States, beginning in Chicago. In less than 2 months, the virus has infected 110 million Americans, killing more than 500,000. The report issued at the conclusion of the exercise outlines the government's limited capacity to respond to a pandemic, with federal agencies lacking the funds, coordination, and resources to facilitate an effective response to the virus. On March 18, 2015, Gates gave a TED Talk on epidemics in Vancouver. That day he wrote on his blog, quote, "I just gave a brief talk on a subject that I've been learning a lot about lately, epidemics. The Ebola outbreak in West Africa is a tragedy, as I write this, more than 10,000 people have died. Gates then added, as awful as this epidemic has been, the next one could be much worse. The world is simply not prepared to deal with a disease, and especially virulent flu, for example, that infects large numbers of people very quickly. Of all the things that could kill 10 million people or more, by far the most likely is an epidemic. In 2019, Gates made a Netflix video as part of the, quote, Explained series, which imagined a wet market in China where live and dead animals are stacked and a highly deadly virus erupts that spreads globally. Gates appears as an expert in the video to warn, quote, if you think of anything that could come along that would kill millions of people, a pandemic is our greatest risk, end quote. He said if nothing was done to better prepare for pandemics, the time would come when the world would look back and wish it had invested more into potential vaccine. Event 201 simulated, quote, an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus transmutated from bats to pigs to people that eventually became efficiently transmissible from person to person, leading to a severe pandemic. The pathogen and the disease it causes are modelled largely on SARS, but it is more transmissible in the community setting by people with mild symptoms. Event 201 also greatly emphasized concerns about such misinformation, disinformation, and suggested increased social media censorship and, quote, limited internet shutdowns to combat the issue.